You're listening to Temps Passé from Bailiwick Podcasts. In this series, we share some of the most important, amusing and illuminating stories from Channel Islands history. This week, we're marking the 80th anniversary of D-Day.
Thanks for coming in today.
You're welcome, Nick.
I'm here to talk about D-Day, and obviously it's something that you've looked at through your blog and through your podcast. Could you take us maybe a bit into the prelude to D-Day as well, what was happening in the islands in the build-up?
Absolutely. Now, I was looking at some unpublished papers at the weekend, actually, and they both the diarists in those cases had noted in the weeks running up from, say, the middle of May, that there had been a lot more aircraft activity around the islands. They were used to seeing reconnaissance aircraft flying at relatively high level, not being too troubled by the anti-aircraft guns and things like that. But they noticed that there had been an uptick in activity where the RAF were actually attacking, local installations here.
And those installations are up at Fort George kind of area, and
that was one of the focuses of their attention, was the radar up at Fort George. There were a number of raids carried out on Fort George. They actually had one on the 4th of June where some typhoons attacked it. They sent over a Spitfire to come and have a look, decided that the Germans were busy repairing it, so they thought they'd better send some more typhoons. So a gentleman called Flight Lieutenant John Saville, who unfortunately died in the second raid. He took part in both of the raids, flying a Typhoon. They have a memorial service actually for him every year. There's one on the 5th of June this year. You can see the plaque, if you're in Guernsey, you can see the plaque as you walk down to Castle Cornet. There's a little memorial there. But he was involved in that raid. And that was on Fort George. The Germans actually got so worried about that they moved a large quantity of their personnel away from Fort George. A lot of islanders moved away from Havelet and the Fort George area as well as those that were displaced by the Germans who needed somewhere to billet themselves after they'd moved away from there.
And I guess in terms of the wider context, why was that kind of raid happening? Why was that important?
That was important because the radar up at Fort George had sufficient range to be able to see the incoming invasion, and they could have reported on that. Unfortunately, the raids didn't disable it completely, and it was reported back via the Navy signal station up at St Jack's. It was reported back that the invasion had started, although no one believed them, thankfully.
And so there was this sense that the Germans were expecting something. Did we saw some change in the structure of the personnel in Guernsey at the time as well?
Yeah, there had been changes in the structure, mostly due to people being sent off to the Eastern Front and things like that. So they ended up with the Ost battalions here, which I think they're also known as the Stomach Battalion. It's basically anyone that had been injured, nursed back to health, but they weren't sort of fighting fit to go and fight on the main front. But there were changes in personnel. Also, there were rumours going around immediately before D-Day. I don't know if you watched The Longest Day, which was on TV at the weekend, that well-known film about D-Day. There's a scene in there where a general gets very, very angry on the 4th of June about people going off to Rennes, fancying, in his words, another night in Rennes, because they were going off to war game scenarios for a potential invasion. Well, actually, the high command from here, the senior officers, had gone to Rennes, and they had to hot-foot it back here. But the rumour that was going around the island when they left was that the Germans were getting ready to leave.
And how were islanders getting their information at the time?
Crystal radios predominantly. Or families that had two normal radios and they'd managed to hang on to one when they were all confiscated. But predominantly it was people who had crystal radios and word of mouth. So there were a lot of rumours going around and things like that.
You can certainly see how that misinformation could spread quite easily.
Oh yes, you have to be so careful when you're looking at people's diaries and accounts of things, because they're only relying on you've got to assess whether they actually took part in seeing an event happen. And even then, you've got to be, careful about what, is there other stuff to back it up, or have they heard it like 10th hand from somebody else? So there's one account that I read where, the actuality is a motor torpedo boat was seen near Guernsey, but by the time you get to reading it a few days later in somebody else's diary, it was a destroyer, two very different vessels. So you have to be very careful about that. But there were rumours because of a lack of information, really, from the outside world. You didn't know what to believe. The Germans were controlling what was printed in the Guernsey press, so they used to, the front page was Reverend Ord described it in his diary at some point, that nobody bothered reading the front page because they knew it was a load of rubbish. But equally, people were very worried because they didn't know what was happening to their relatives that were in the UK. So they couldn't be certain. They could listen to the BBC reports if they had a hidden radio, but they still couldn't be certain, what the actual facts were. They knew there was bombing going on and things like that. So it was a big worry.
And I guess there must have been a concern as well what the invasion could mean for the islands, and whether actually would be directly involved, or depending on where the troops landed.
Yeah, absolutely. So when D-Day started, they could see the aircraft coming down, because a lot of the aircraft that dropped the 82nd and the 101st Airborne actually came down between Guernsey and the French coast, and then turned in and came behind the beaches because they didn't want to fly over the beaches. So from about 11 o'clock in the evening on the 5th, people could hear the drone of the aircraft. They couldn't at that stage see anti-aircraft fire from Guernsey because, for some reason, I've seen it in multiple accounts, they don't, despite the fact the Germans have been on a high state of alert for 2 weeks, nobody seemed to have started firing, or certainly around St. Peterborough, until about 3 in the morning. So, varying accounts, but 2 to 3 in the morning seems to be about the time that they opened fire. So they were aware that was going on. Later on, they could see the bombardment of the coastline. Ralph Durand, in his diary, talks about the fact that it's 4 years since they witnessed things from being the other way round, albeit 4 years ago it wasn't on the same scale of what they were seeing now in terms of the bombardment of the French coast. So people were then thinking, well, maybe they're going to come for us. Quite upbeat, particularly as they heard of things progressing on their radios. So certainly people were listening to the BBC on the 6th of June and listening to progress that was being reported about the D-Day landings. There was news coming from the other side, actually, which was reported in the British newspapers because it was picked up from German radio, and it was actually reported on the 6th of June, but the Germans broadcast on Radio Bremen that the British and the Americans had landed on Jersey and Guernsey, and there had been massive street fighting. No idea why whether it was they actually thought that had happened, or it was just some sort of weird propaganda type thing to try and spook people. Who knows? But I've read the newspaper articles that have reported that. It just seems very odd. So people who were from the Channel Islands who'd evacuated must have been very worried if they read that. But as time went on, people started thinking, well, the Allies are getting closer and closer. So by the 18th of June, they'd reached Carteret, so highly visible from Sark, for instance, and not too far away. So people were thinking, they'll be coming for us soon. But then they realised they weren't. Quite rightly, the Allies had looked at it and said, it's just going to cause too much in the way of civilian deaths and destruction to actually do this, as well as the military personnel that would have been involved. The resources were needed elsewhere. The Germans here were no threat to them, effectively. Aside from one commando raid in 1945, they didn't really participate anymore in the war. Aside from the odd little skirmish here and there, they were effectively in a prison camp that you didn't need to guard, which was when you've got 30,000 German troops effectively bottled up, can't go anywhere. Why would you attack and risk your own, British civilian lives?
In terms of the military side of it as well, the anti-aircraft fire did cause one casualty in Guernsey. Was that on D-Day itself as well?
It was, yeah. That was an unfortunate gentleman, Mr. Malbon of the Vale, who unfortunately was killed at 7:30 in the morning. The problem, of course, is when you're firing anti-aircraft guns is what goes up must come down. So you've got all these shell fragments and things that are coming down, as well as you get a dud that doesn't go off properly, and the whole thing will come down. There was a Mr. Gehan who had a house on the Strand, which was fortunately was unoccupied, and one of the raids around D-Day, it wasn't on D-Day itself, but his house was hit by a £1,000 bomb from a British aircraft, I believe it was, and he was sort of very philosophical on it, because the house had been badly damaged when the Germans bombed in June 1940, and he hadn't really decided what he was going to do about it because he couldn't get the materials to repair it. And I thought his response was quite sort of philosophical, and he went, "Oh well, that's just solved the problem of what I do," which is just, an incredible view to take on it.
And the relationship with the authorities, the German authorities in the island, that dynamic must have changed as D-Day happened, and as things progressed from there as well.
It did, especially as you get later on with the change of the German commandant as well. Later on in the war, things definitely were very uneasy. The lack of food, there was a constant battle to try and get supplies, because of course once the Allies had occupied most of the Cherbourg Peninsula, then it was very difficult to get any sort of supplies here. Plus there was a lot of aerial activity, Allied aircraft that were harassing shipping coming to the islands. The Germans obviously wanted shipping. I mean, they weren't very helpful at the best of times earlier on in the war in terms of getting stuff across for civilians. They'd always change priorities on what that ship was being used for and stuff. So stuff took ages to get here. But it just got to the point where it was pretty much impossible. I mean, the Germans couldn't even get an aircraft into here until October 1944. That was the first aircraft that landed here with any supplies anyway. And
there was also, we continue on, and there was some U-boats that came in.
Yes,
well,
yeah,
wasn't there?
Yeah, there were some U-boats that came in. One of them, U-275, came in, was attacked in the harbour. A couple of supply ships were set on fire. They moved the U-boat, which had already been damaged, which was why it was here. They moved it into the old harbour, so just in front of Marks and Spencer's and Creasy's there. And they moved it in there, and then dropped a bomb on it. But the RAF dropped a bomb on it. The American Air Force also had a go at it, but a £1,000 bomb was dropped into the old harbour and blew out all of the windows along the seafront and some in the high street as well. These raids were quite carefully timed, because what they wanted to do was avoid civilian casualties where possible. So they were usually timed for early in the morning before anybody was going into town to go to work, to try and reduce the potential for civilian casualties. That submarine did leave Guernsey and was attacked on its way out of the harbour, but it did get away. But shortly after that, the Germans declared it as not a safe place for boats to come, for U-boats to come.
Have you had a look at the policing side of things as well at all? Is that...
Yeah, I have. In terms of D-Day, or just
in terms of D-Day, because as I understood it from, I think I was reading one of Bill Bell's books, was in what the immediate response was meant to be from gathering the police together, and actually what happened was quite different because of the communication problems.
Yeah, they did have communication problems. The civilian police obviously weren't feeling particularly helpful towards the Germans in any case, especially given what had gone on earlier on in the occupation in terms of treatment of the Guernsey police. So yeah, there was confusion. The Germans were wandering around. If there were groups of people gathering, talking, then they were fining them for doing that, or at least telling them to disperse. So there was a lot of confusion about what was going on. It got to the point where people were leaving their front doors unlocked. There were that many RAF air raids going on. So in town, people were leaving their doors unlocked. So if the air raid sirens did go off, people could just dive into their house to take some form of shelter.
Oh, how would you describe the mood in the island around this kind of time?
Well, it went from a sense of it's all going to be over very quickly, and people started to become more indiscreet in terms of showing their lapel badge that had been cut from a coin with the king on it and things like that. And being much more optimistic about the fact that the Germans were going to be gone soon, and that was partially fueled as well by the fact that the Germans didn't really seem to know what they were doing in the immediate days after D-Day. So you were getting some evidence of them sort of packing up shop and about to disappear, but then that turned into just moving things around or moving artillery to Jersey from here. So it was just the general confusion, really, I think. And then it turned to disappointment. Some people understood. It's very easy for us sitting here in 2024 to say, well, the reasons why they didn't come was, the massive loss of life that would have been involved, the fact they needed those resources for the campaign to defeat the Germans. It's very easy for us to do that sat here now when you've got very little information, or in particular confused information and only rumours and things like that. At the time, I might have had a completely different opinion of what was going on. In fact, I almost certainly would have had a completely different opinion. I might have been quite an angry Mr. Lahire because they hadn't come to liberate us. It's interesting that in some of the reports of people that escaped, when they were interviewed by the security services in the UK, as they predominantly were, there's a number where they complain that there haven't been enough RAF air raids on the Channel Islands. You've got Guernsey people saying we would have welcomed them. Really, very. So you can't win, really, in that respect. So people were disappointed. They realised that it was going to cause real problems food-wise, but gave the civilian government a real massive headache as well. As well as the Germans. It's interesting that in September 1944, Major Chambers came from Carteret on an RAF launch in order to attempt to get a surrender, to persuade the Germans here to surrender. He had with him a Mr. Black, who was a general who had been captured in 1943, and he had been persuaded to come along to persuade the German commandant that the right thing to do was surrender. They dropped messages to arrange a rendezvous, which when they got there, it became apparent the Germans weren't coming. That was because the messages had actually landed 1 mile off the coast and not inland where they'd been intended. So despite being ordered not to, Chambers actually ordered the boat to come towards St. Peter Port, and they anchored just outside of St. Peter Port. A German boat came along. Unsurprisingly, Mr. Black, the German general, wasn't willing to accompany Major Chambers onto the German vessel to go and have discussions, because he was a little bit worried he might not be coming back if that was the case. But they basically said what the reason for their visit was. Message was sent back, and the commandant said he didn't need any advice about surrendering and to go away, or he'd open fire on them. So they went back. But Chambers actually got the DSO for that, the Distinguished Service Order, for undertaking that, because they did come under fire as they were heading back to France, and had risk just being basically captured.
When it did come, we go down a few months down the line, obviously, to 9th of May is a date that's inscribed in all Guernsey people's heads, I guess, isn't it?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And there's, one particular bit of film. I think it's really the only moving film footage. There's a lot of photographs of Liberation Day, but there was some film taken by Dr. Sutcliffe, who was here for the whole of the occupation, had kept a cine camera and film hidden away just for such an occasion. And he filmed, it's a very short film, it's only a few minutes, and he filmed some of the people in town and the celebrations, etc. And you can just see the relief on people's faces. But some of them had lost so much weight during the course of the occupation, particularly those that lived in town, because they couldn't secretly grow stuff in their garden because they didn't have a garden to do that in. So whilst the Germans were controlling what the people in the countryside were growing, it was still possible to do something without them catching, or hopefully without them catching you. So supplement your rations. So particularly the people that were from St. Peterport, were not in good shape at all. I interviewed a lady a few weeks back who was a nurse. She came off her shift first thing in the morning and heard that there was going to be something happening. We were going to be liberated. So instead of going back to her lodgings, herself and another nurse pedalled all the way to town from out in the Catel just to come and see what was happening, despite the fact they'd been up all night working. People came from a long distance to come and see those coming to liberate us.
Nick, appreciate your time. It's been great to chat.
Thanks very much. Always a pleasure.
Temps Passé from Bailiwick Podcasts.